Emil, and we are here every Monday at 10 a.m. Pacific time, 1 p.m. Eastern time. I have to kind of think about that on occasion. And then, of course, an hour in for Central and Mountain time. And before I get to my guest, really the first guest we've had on this show, I do want to remind you that we are indeed here every week. And this show is designed for people who want to learn more about trusts and estates, how they can apply that to their own finances, but also for people who are interested in potentially enhancing their own businesses by getting involved in this area of however it would tie into your business, whether as a financial professional, a real estate person, etc. So, that having said, I'm very pleased to introduce my guest, Cheryl Munk, and I have a real brief bio that I put together for her, and I want to make sure that I get in the relevant points. So Cheryl is a freelance reporter on business and personal finance. She writes for a variety of national and international publications, including the Wall Street Journal, which is how we got connected. And she writes on a wide range of topics for both consumers and finance professionals, including investing, student loan debt, wealth management, the financial advisory business, insurance, retirement planning, and small businesses. So it really fits in well with both the topic that we discuss on this show, Cheryl, as well as the various people who would be interested in it. And I mentioned that we met through the Wall Street Journal. So Cheryl had an article published back on May 19th called "When Naming a Trustee for Your Estate, Ask Yourself These 4 Questions." And I saw the article and read it and thought, this is really solid advice for anybody who's operating in this realm. And then when I looked up Cheryl's background, I said, wow, this is even better. She has a really deep, knowledge and background in all of this. And so I quickly contacted her, and she was kind enough to agree to come on the show. So Cheryl, first of all, welcome to Trust and Estates Weekly. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah.
Very excited to be here.
Well, that's good. So, let's just, if you don't mind, kind of jump right into the topic that your article covers, which is preparing or choosing a trustee. I want to set it up because I think people. I've mentioned this on the show before. I think when people hear estate, they think like, oh, I must have some mansion in the English countryside. But these days where, if you own a house, you own a valuable asset. I mean, the median home price in the US is what? Slightly under, I think, $400,000. So, that's a substantial asset. And it may very well make sense for people to use a trust to avoid probate. And so then they're faced with choosing a trustee. So I think this topic applies to a much broader range of people than might otherwise seem to be the case.
Well, I also just want to jump in there because one of the things had to be really careful about when writing this article is I think people get confused because there is such a thing as a living trust, and then there are trusts within a will. And those are really 2 different things. And so a living trust is probably going to be most appropriate. Well, it can be appropriate for a lot of different reasons, but I know, for example, like I'm in New Jersey, in our state, it's not such an issue. The probate is not such a big deal. But in a state like California, probate's just like really a horrible process. And so basically you need a living trust there to be able to disseminate your assets after death. But there can, in a will, even just in a regular will, let's just say you don't have what's something called the living will or living trust, I think it's also called. Right. You can do trusts within a will such that your children don't get your money outright. That would be an example. So let's say you have $1 million and you have 2 children. You don't want to give that $1 million outright to the children. You can set it up to go into trust when you die. So, but they're talking about, it's the same concept because you still need a trustee either way. But I just want to be clear that we can be talking about 2 different things.
Okay, yeah, and I mean, and that's a great point. And as well, one could set up like a special needs trust, right, in advance.
Correct.
Like if you have a child, for example, who maybe is neurodiverse or something like that. So then you may even set it up right in advance of passing away. But the issue is, again, you still have to have a trustee. And it doesn't
Correct.
necessarily have to be a huge amount. I know my daughter has a trust that was set up for her by her grandmother, and it was funded with $100,000, which again,
Right.
not the millions we sometimes think of when we think of trusts and estates.
Right. Well, I think that's actually a really interesting point because, oh, I don't really have that much. Like you were saying before, oh, maybe I only have a house. But even so, you're going to sell the house at some point after the house will be sold. So what's going to happen to those assets? And you want to be, I would think people would want to be able to say what happens to their assets after they die. But the statistics are pretty shocking. And I don't actually have them in front of me, but the statistics in terms of how many people don't have a will are pretty shocking. They're pretty high up there. So, which means that people don't have trust because they don't have a will.
Right,
So, or
right, yeah, yeah. I mean, it's an interesting point because when I was in the military, so one of the first things they have you do, require you to do really, before they'll let you deploy, especially into a combat zone, is you have to have at least a will, right? And it's amazing, here are people who are at least ostensibly, working in a job that has existential consequences, right? They most don't have wills, and a lot are young, of course, and they think, well, what do I need this for? But otherwise, if you don't have a will or a trust or something, then you're really at the mercy of whatever the laws of the jurisdiction that takes over says you have to do.
it can cause a lot more fighting among your heirs. I mean, assuming you have heirs, but even if you don't, you're going to have someone to give it to, and it really is a problem. It's just much easier. It's much cleaner, in most cases, to set things up in advance.
Yeah,
I
and,
say
and
most cases because there can be fighting, but after death. But it's still better than not having something,
yeah,
in my
and I think
opinion.
it's pretty easily done these days to have a simple will. It's not expensive, and
Absolutely.
yeah.
Right.
So let's sort of move into the subject then of choosing a trustee, because I having been a trustee myself, it's not so obvious, what kind of qualities that person needs to have, and what's really going to be involved. So maybe if you wouldn't mind, start out by talking about some of those issues, like what does a trustee do, and how does that then relate to the qualifications that someone should consider, when they're choosing a trustee?
Okay, so the trustee is going to be responsible for making financial decisions related to the assets that are held in the trust. So it could be, for a very simple estate, it may be, so, maybe just, let's say a house, or maybe it's just, like you said, mentioned before, $100,000, maybe something like that. But in a very complicated estate, you could have real estate, you could have multiple cars. Let's say you were a car connoisseur, but, there could be lots of different assets. Could own apartment buildings. I mean, real estate, you could own, I mean, you could be an apartment owner, for example, and have that within your estate. There are lots of different things that trustee could be responsible for doing. Um, and there could be a lot of, I mean, you have to be in charge of the financial aspects of the trust. And then also, if you're going in their assets, and then you'll have to find a way to manage those assets, whether that's for yourself or hiring a third party to do it. So there's lots of moving parts.
So
Um,
you're basically the overall caretaker of anything that is held in the trust.
Exactly.
And-
Exactly. But that's not a job for everybody because, I mean, if you have no financial background, it's just not going to be as easy. One of the, and I'm not an attorney, but one of the attorneys I spoke to when I was writing this article, was giving the example of a young person, and nothing against young people and their financial prowess, but let's say you're an 18-year-old and you don't have any financial experience. Maybe you've taken a personal finance class in high school. Hopefully more high schools are doing that these days. It's a great thing. But let's just say you have really no financial experience. How are you going to know how to manage $100,000, $1 million, $2 million, whatever that number may be? It's just not necessarily realistic. And on top of that, you're going to have to deal with accountants and lawyers and financial advisors potentially. Like there's a whole bunch of professionals that you're going to have to deal with. It's just not an easy job. And it's not something if you have, if it's a very small trust, maybe, but if you're talking hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars, you really need to think, in my opinion, you really need to think twice about whether, the 18-year-old is the right person to put in charge of that money.
Well, yeah, and I think about my daughter she's not 18, but she's going to be 16 soon, and so in another couple of years she could qualify to be a trustee, and she is taking personal finance in high school this year, and it's I've helped her with it a lot, so it's just that experience alone. I don't think she would be particularly comfortable doing it. Plus, there's the whole side of sort of knowing what you don't know and then being able to ask intelligent questions of your advisors, right? So how does someone who's
Right.
inexperienced deal with that?
Right. And there's a whole other aspect too, because if you're dealing with let's say you have your assets are going to two siblings, and one of them is 18 and one of them is 15, and you make the 18-year-old the trustee, that really potentially pits the 18-year-old against the sibling, and that really could be a bad situation. So there's so many factors that go into it. It's not an easy decision by any means. And sometimes people just don't have those familial relationships to be able to name someone who is in the family as a trustee.
Okay, so that being the case, then aside from having the knowledge and maybe the experience, what other issues is it important to consider as you choose or interview trustees, or whatever process someone's going through?
Well, it sounds like a kind of an obvious thing, but you want to really make sure you trust the person. One of the attorneys that I interviewed was telling me a story, and it's in my article, but it was about basically if I remember right, bear with me. It was this, but any example it could be. It's similar examples could happen. The brother named his brother as a trustee for the estate, but the brother did all sorts of things like buy. I think it was some kind of a ship, not a ship. Oh my gosh, what was it? What's it called? One of those. Oh my goodness, I can't think of the name. It
Is it
was a well, whatever. He bought something that wasn't really appropriate and wasn't really going to be benefit the son. It was jet skis. That's the word I
oh,
was looking for.
okay.
Sorry, jet skis. And that you're hard pressed to say how that's going to benefit the 2-year-old. And so
Oh,
was the brother really, I think that maybe he felt that it was going to be something the family could use later on. But even if there aren't, ulterior motives and like negative things, like you're doing it, let's say you're the trustee and you want to go buy a motor home. Maybe you really do have a good motive because, oh, you think that's a great investment. But at the same time, if that's not going to be in the best interest of the child, number one, you're not doing your duty. And number two, you're really not, that's not the intent the person had in naming you the trustee.
right.
So you really just have to be careful that the person you name is going to be someone who will really follow your wishes.
And that raises I think a related issue, which is a trustee acts as a fiduciary, and we hear this. I mean, for those who are fans of the movie Mary Poppins, Fidelity Fiduciary Bank. That's it goes all the way back to then, my knowledge. But the idea of acting for the beneficiaries of the trust or the estate, outside of any other considerations, there can be some very specific aspects of that, right? That the trustee has to then.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's all well and good when the person's willing to, when understands that they have that fiduciary responsibility and follow that fiduciary responsibility. Now, of course, they're supposed to do it. It's not legal not to do it. But if they don't do it, you still have to go through the whole headache of proving they're not doing it, and it's a whole legal headache. And meanwhile, there are legal fees that are coming out of the trust for the person to defend himself or herself. So I'm not saying, look, you never know when you name someone, like you hope you're doing the best thing, right? But if you know that your brother-in-law has a history of drug abuse or has a history of he's been, I'm sorry, like, just making things up, but like he's been in jail for stealing, like, Rob, good idea to name him as trustee.
Right. I mean, interestingly enough, I'm dealing with a situation right now where the trustee has been defraying funds in a trust, it appears not for the benefit of the minor beneficiary, right? And in talking to my lawyer about it, the solution could be as expensive as the misuse of assets, right? I mean, that's the reality of that kind of thing today. So we want someone who is trustworthy. We want someone who has the knowledge and experience, as well as, shall we say, the willingness to be a trustee. What else would you look at in terms of choosing a trustee?
Well, so I don't think we can look at this in a vacuum. So sometimes you don't have anyone, for example, who meets those criteria exactly. But let's say that there's a person you have in mind who has an amazing relationship with your children and really knows what you would want for your children and how you would want your money to be spent on the children. There's nothing saying you can't name that person as a co-trustee. And then hire, let's say, a professional trustee, such as a bank or a trust company, or even a private professional who's a trustee. If there's something saying you can't do that, or maybe you have an attorney who could be a co-trustee with this other person who just really knows the family. So that's another consideration as well.
So kind of create a team, if you will.
Exactly.
And so the benefit then is you can pair sort of family knowledge and insight with skill. What might be the downsides to a co-trustee arrangement?
Well, in a co-trustee arrangement, you need to have agreement. They need to act together.
Mm-hmm.
And so the great example that an attorney gave me was that if you name two sisters to be co-trustees and they can't be in the same room together, then basically, what are you doing? Like, you're not making, if they can't agree, then, and they have a history of not being able to agree, then you're really, you're setting yourself up for failure. But if you name someone who's a professional and you name someone who has your children's best interest in heart because they know your children and they know your family closely, then it's not so much of a disadvantage. But you really want to make sure that whoever you name as a co-trustee is going to be able to work together.
Would you?
That's the goal.
Right. And would you recommend perhaps having the two potential co-trustees meet ahead of time and kind of see how that interaction goes? Or is
so like I don't know how I never thought, I mean, we did our own will, like we never really thought about that, but we did kind of think to ourselves, like, oh, well, what would happen if in this case, I think, I mean, some of these things, like you think about to the extent possible, but you can't come up with every possible thing that could go wrong. You try and come up as many as possible. I think it's really just a matter of thinking things through a to a large extent and kind of bouncing ideas off, like if you're making it with somebody else, or maybe bouncing it off a professional saying, hey, I'm thinking of doing XYZ and naming these two people. Maybe just bouncing it off your attorney, because maybe the attorney can say to you, well, do these people get along? Do these people have experience? And there may be other questions that come up in the course of those just conversations that may make you think, ooh, one time when we were doing a will years and years ago, we were naming my father as trustee, and we were talking about naming him as trustee, and one of the things that the attorney mentioned as well, you know, you need a second trustee, and you need to make sure that the person, like things that you're thinking about, think of age. Because if you're naming someone who is much older at the time you're naming them, and you want your will to last 5, 10 years, is that going to be feasible as well, right? If like people have to redo their wills, right? You can't expect to have to create a will and then set it and forget it.
Right.
But you want to at least be able to last ideally 5 years. So let's just take that as a roughly 5 years. But if you're naming your 95-year-old aunt as a trustee and she's the one that you're relying on, maybe that's not such a good idea.
Right. I
I mean,
mean,
these things sound like common sense, but people say, but I really love great aunt so and so, and she loves my kids. And
right.
people just sometimes need a little direction to be able to name the appropriate parties.
Got it. Yeah, I mean, it absolutely makes sense. I know when I set up my trust, um, my friends who are my peers, they're all the same age as me, and the idea of appointing them as a trustee didn't seem to make a whole lot of sense because if I'm getting to the point where I'm dying and leaving whatever, so there's a good chance many of my friends might have or be at the point where they're not fit. So I reached out to a friend who's Navy colleague who's considerably younger than me, and I said, hey, look, would you be willing to be the trustee? And he said, why are you asking me? And I said, well, A, finances because he has a real estate investment company, and B, frankly, you're 25 years younger than I am, so it seemed like a good match.
And that's the other thing to consider, though, is these things I mean, you want, like I said, when you write a will or you write a trust, you don't want it to be something that you're going to have to rewrite tomorrow. But you really do need to keep in mind, well, we want this to get us for the next 5 years. And then maybe that's a different discussion in 5 years or 10 years. It may not be that same trustee that you use today. You might not want to name that person in 10 years. So you don't necessarily, when you're naming someone, you don't necessarily, that person doesn't necessarily have to be the person that you would name for 50 years.
Mm,
You know, because you should be reviewing your will. And obviously, you want to get it right the first time, but circumstances do change. And I wrote another story, and an attorney had told me about an example of, they named the aunt as something, even as a guardian, maybe for a child. But then at some point, that aunt was just too old to do it.
mm,
So
mm.
these things have to be fluid and adjust.
Sure, sure. Now, a few minutes ago, you mentioned the idea of either as a trustee or as a co-trustee, a bank or maybe a professional, an individual who's a professional fiduciary or something. So, would you talk a little bit more about what those are and how those work, and what you see as being sort of perhaps the more appropriate situations for them, sort of compare and contrast, maybe, if you will.
Sure. So the professionals, like a bank or a trust company, a lot of it's going to depend on your asset size. You're
Mhm.
not going to want to go to a bank if you have a very, very small estate. The people I spoke to for the story I wrote was saying that basically a bank is good generally for a larger trust, so around 5 million or higher.
Okay.
And the idea of having that dedicated trust administrator who's a professional, it can really offer that peace of mind that the estate will be handled appropriately for a long time. Because once, you can have a trust for a long time, and then for you'd have that kind of ongoing administration. If the person working on the account is not available, you have a whole bunch of sort of people around you who are also able to be working on it.
Mhm.
So that's the advantage there. A trust company may be someone in the 1 million, if for a trust in the 1 million to 5 million range is a general rule of thumb. I mean, these are not absolutes. I got a letter from a reader saying, you said one company, don't use trust companies. And he mentioned a trust company that had the name Trust in it. I said, yes, but that happens to be a bank also. So the trust company, it's not, there are big trust companies that have trust in the name, but in that case, if it's all they do, it's more like a bank in that respect. So you're running, it's a little confusing to people, and I can see where people would get confused. But the big bank slash trust company is really going to be the for the bigger estates, and then you're going to have for this, maybe a smaller trust company. I don't really want to mention names, because I don't want to look like I'm recommending
Right.
one
Sure.
over another, but just because it says it may be a very large bank
Hmm.
with a trust operation, but you hear the trust, but it has trust in the full name of it. So that doesn't, I hope that was
Right.
clear.
Yeah. Yeah. For sure. For sure. And um, would a wealth manager be an appropriate trustee for a trust, do you think, or should they be used more as kind of a if you will, almost like a consultant or an allied professional that the trustee relies on for specific
It
skill?
depends. It depends on the wealth manager. I mean, certain wealth managers have trust companies within them. I mean, I didn't look into that specifically, so I'm a little hesitant to go down that road. But I know that there are large wealth management companies that have trust divisions, and I think that would be okay. I would be a little bit more careful about using my small wealth advisor who is a one person shop to be the trustee. I think there's a lot of the whole idea of a professional, some of these bigger organizations, is that they have a lot of checks and balances to protect your money.
Mhm.
If you're dealing with like a very small operation, even though they're supposed to be fiduciaries, the fewer the checks and balances, the more risk there is to your money. So I think for me, if I were going to go with a professional, I would want to go with a company, number one, a reputable company that has a lot of checks and balances in place so I would know that my money was going to be protected. Um, that's not to say it wouldn't be,
Mhm.
but interestingly, I was told when the reporting of this article that a lot of independent lawyers and wealth managers won't do it anymore for that very reason. Because you do read in the news these horror stories where, so and so lawyer siphoned off so and so's trust.
Right.
And obviously that wasn't the intention, and it was a bad apple. And I'm not saying lawyers are bad. I'm just saying that, there are situations, and you can never really be 100% sure. But if an organization has a lot of, like I said, these checks and balances, it makes it a little bit more secure.
Right. So, and here in California, we have a licensed profession called a professional fiduciary. And so, and I guess that that's not true in all 50 states by any stretch. I think it's maybe between 10 and 15 states that have that, although it appears to be growing. And I suspect that's coming out of this issue where individuals would handle estates, and the next thing you know, the beneficiaries have been left without anything because they've siphoned off the money, and there was nobody watching over what they were doing, that could exercise that oversight, that to keep things
Right.
on the up and up, so to speak. So
Exactly. You'd asked me before about some of the advantages and disadvantages. So I think I gave you the advantages. The disadvantage really could come down to cost.
mhm.
So a bank and a trust company may charge between 0.5% and 2% of the overall value of the trust,
Mm.
which could be a hefty amount. Or if you don't reach that level, the minimum fee to handle the account might be between $2,500 and $5,000. So, I mean, the fees can add up. But you have to decide. But trustees also, like if you have just like a regular, like your mom does it, like she's also able to take a fee. So you just have to kind of weigh. Sometimes in these really, especially really, really big estates, the fee could just end up being a drop in the bucket. There's always fees involved. So especially if you plan to pass the estate down from generation to generation to generation, it may really just be that the professional trust company or bank is really the way to go,
Right.
notwithstanding the fees.
Right. And at least that way you have sort of the continuity, number one, and you keep that corporate knowledge within the organization, right? So okay. Now, I don't know if you didn't necessarily cover this in the article. Um, However, I thought I would address this to get your thoughts. So, what is the trustee's responsibility once the trustee is managing the trust in terms of reporting or anything like that? How does that work? Because it could be, for example, that you know you're still like in a special needs trust, for example, you may still be alive, right? You set up the trust for your child, but you're not going to be the trustee. You were just the grantor. So what responsibility is there then for the trustee to report periodically either to the grantor or to the beneficiaries or like a guardian on behalf of the beneficiary, something like that?
So that's an area where I don't have a lot of familiarity, but I can just say generally that it is going to depend on the trust. I mean, they're going to be reporting requirements, but I think it's going to depend on the trust and the type of trust, and frankly, the assets in the trust to see exactly what those reporting and other requirements are.
So so it sounds like that's when the trust is being written, that's an issue you want to address to your lawyer or the individual that's drawing up the paperwork, is how often is information going to be required of the trustee?
Think so. And also just, kind of to lay out exactly, especially if you're asking a friend or a family member, it's a good idea to say, can you tell me exactly what the responsibilities of the trustee are going to be for my particular estate? Because again, it's going to be different depending on the assets. Like if I just have a very straightforward, if I have a house and a car and a dog, it's going to be very different than if I own apartment buildings and I manage multiple properties and I have all these other things within the trust. So I think it's always a good idea just to say, what's going to be involved. And some of that's really going to depend on the assets that you have in the trust.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm glancing up here. We're coming up on our 30-minute time limit. So I just before we sort of wrap this up, just want to give you an opportunity to sort of any final thoughts you have on this subject that you'd like to share.
I just want to say that I really think it's important because there's just so many people who don't go through this process. And I really just I can't stress enough how important it is to think about these things ahead of time. You're really doing yourself and your family, your future generations a really big disservice if you don't think about these things. And you're doing them an amazing service if you are thinking about these things ahead of time. And look, you've worked hard your whole life and you've gathered and have a lot of assets potentially, or even if you don't have a lot of assets, you still have assets and you want to see those passed on how you would like to see it. So I think it's just very important to number one, have a will or a trust. And if you have a living trust, make sure you put the assets into the living trust. Don't just create a trust, but make sure you transfer the assets in. But also really think long and hard about who the people are that you're choosing to help execute your wishes after you're gone. I just think it's very important.
Great. I think that's really a good way to sum it up. So thank you, Cheryl, very much. Let's see. I know you can be found on LinkedIn for people who want to follow you. Are you on other social media for people who want to follow your work?
Twitter as well.
Okay, yeah. So
Yeah, and I post all my articles on LinkedIn and Twitter.
Okay, great. So yeah, and I'll put those links to your Twitter and LinkedIn page in the show notes so people can have the ability to follow you. And I noticed when I was looking at your LinkedIn profile earlier today, there's already several more articles that you've written on I think very timely topics that we all need to know about. And I mean, my daughter is fortunate in that she had personal finance in high school, but I know I never did. That was before my time. I had wood shop, so.
Okay.
So again,
Have
Cheryl,
a nice napkin holder.
yeah, exactly. So Cheryl, thank you very much. Before we sign off, I just want to mention that tomorrow, Tuesday, is my regular show, Business Lessons from the Military, and that is at 11 o'clock Pacific, 11 a.m. Pacific time, 2 p.m. Eastern time. And then on Wednesday is People Making Money. And that's kind of the broadest of my shows. It's all issues related to career, business, finances, and wealth management. And I'm sorry, building wealth. And so that show is at 12:30 p.m. Pacific time, 3:30 p.m. Eastern time. And you can also go, of course, to our YouTube channel where all the shows, including this one with Cheryl, are available for viewing, and would encourage you, of course, to subscribe. And then anytime a new show comes on, you'll be able to watch it. So, Cheryl, again, I just want to wrap up by thanking you very much for spending this time with me today. And it's a really important topic, as you mentioned. And hopefully, as time goes by, we'll have you on again, and we'll touch on some of the other topics that you deal with that'll help people out as they pursue their financial lives, looking to make good decisions.
Well, thank you so much for having me. This has been a lot of fun.
Great. Just signing off, as I always do. Marie, darling, you still are my belle, even when Cheryl is here on the show with me. So thanks very much for watching, folks, and we'll see you soon.